Ryan Delk, welcome back to the Deep End.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's kind of funny when I ask or make that opening statement to guests. It's sort of, you've been in the deep end this entire time. As a startup founder, so obviously you've consistently been in the deep end, and I'm doing my yearly check-in to see how you're doing with everything. But I think this would be a great time just to sort of set up this episode with an introduction to you, and obviously an introduction to Primer, the actual company you're building. And then we'll, of course, talk about the broader education space, which we've been covering through this series about big problems in the world. But yeah, introduce yourself, what company you're building, and then we'll go from there.
I'm Ryan Delk, co-founder and CEO of Primer. And Primer's goal is to build a new kind of education system in the US. And so we can talk more about that maybe perhaps later in the episode, but the sort of very quick version is we work with sort of top 1% teachers and help them launch their own microschools. And they are able to serve their local community with a group of 10 to 25, 30 students. And we sort of give them everything they need to be able to launch a school in their neighborhood or wherever they live. And so it's a sort of a way for great teachers to be able to do what they love without all the bureaucracy. And then for families and for students to get this sort of smaller environment, personalized education. And we do a lot of work sort of to ensure that the educational experience for kids is amazing. The parent experience is great. The teacher experience is great. So we can talk about all that. But yeah, the quick background on me, and I'll give the quick version. You can tell me if we want to dig in more. The sort of inspiration from Primer goes way back. My mom was a public school teacher. We moved to Florida, and she took me to kindergarten orientation. And she was actually sort of a sort of anti-alternative education. She wrote a paper when she was getting her teaching degree on sort of against homeschooling and alternative education. But she took me to kindergarten orientation. She sort of had this crisis where she's like, I can't leave you here. And we didn't have a lot of money, so private school wasn't an option. It was really public school or homeschool. And so she decided to homeschool me, she thought, for maybe a year, but ended up homeschooling me and my two younger siblings all kindergarten through 8th grade for 16 years total across the three of us. And really what she started was what we would call today like a micro school. She worked with, found other families that were in our neighborhood that wanted to kind of have an alternative education experience. And she helped create this amazing sort of K through 8th experience for us, where it was like all the buzzwords now, like project-based learning and mastery-based education and all this stuff. Like that's all stuff she was doing, 20, 30 years ago. And so it's just this unbelievable experience for me. And so when you fast forward, a couple decades later, my wife and I started having kids, and I realized that was the education experience that I wanted my kids to have. And at first I just assumed that it must have existed and someone must have built it in those decades since I experienced that. And then I realized that they hadn't. And so that's kind of the original origin story for Primer, was sort of wanting my kids to have the same kind of education that I had, and then realizing that I think there's actually something really big to be built here because of a lot of the macro trends that are happening right now, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
First thing I want to talk about though is I love the phrasing of top 1% teachers, because it kind of raises so many different questions or like intuitive notions. So like, was that great teacher I had like a 10% teacher? Is it like a 1% teacher? So several things here. So one, define what a top 1% teacher is from your perspective as a founder, obviously, in this space.
We get tons of applications from teachers that want to launch micro schools. Right now we're in Florida in several cities, and then Arizona in the Phoenix area. And there's a few things that we consider like table stakes, and then there's a few things that we look for that sort of we know will make them really great fits. Our sort of base level is like someone who's really great instructionally. So we get videos of them teaching. Sometimes we'll do references of people that have taught with them or students that we had or different things. There's this sort of bar that we have of, hey, is this person really great at whether they're a kindergarten teacher or an 8th grade teacher? Are they really great at whatever subject matter they're teaching? Is it an engaging conversation? And do they find ways to sort of break the mold of the traditional like sort of education model where it's a teacher, sitting in the front of the classroom, sort of lecturing 30 students as they sort of take notes and, aren't that interested. And so that's sort of the academic side. And then that's sort of like the table stakes. The things that we look for that really set them apart is we talk to them about things like, okay, let's assume you have a student that's really interested in podcasting or is really interested in, how to, become like work on an NFL team as a statistician or something. And we asked them like, what would you why to do for that student? Where would you take that interest? Let's say you could work with them for 3 years. And it's amazing, the traditional system can condition you to say like, oh, I'd have them, write a book report about it, or I'd have them read some books, or I'd have them, write a business plan or whatever. And then you talk to these teachers that are like, oh, if this student was really into, podcasting, I would like help them launch a podcast, and I would figure out how to get their first 1,000 listeners, and I would go help them get guests, and I would see if we could raise money or save money to get a studio, like a little mobile studio set up. Or if this kid was really into football and wanted to work for an NFL team, I'd see if we could get him like an apprenticeship, or he could, work with the Miami Dolphins in Miami or something. And you find these teachers that are willing to go like way above and beyond. And it's actually a pretty high number of teachers, and think way outside the box for kids. And that's like a huge part of Primer, is what we call pursuits, which is this, multiple hours a day where kids can go deep on the things that they're excited about. And so that's kind of the second bucket, is when they see a spark in a student, like where do they take that? Where do they want to go with that? And then the final piece is that these teachers really are entrepreneurs. They're really launching their own business, their own school. And so there's a lot of things that come with that, as far as, it's not just, you're not teaching as part of, 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 teachers at a big school. You're kind of running this as like a small business, as your own sort of entrepreneurial endeavor. And so we look for things that we think will be signals of them being able to successfully do that, like recruit students, find locations, be able to, grow and expand, maybe recruit other teachers to join, adjacent micro schools, things like that. So that's kind of what we look for. And we're still really early, so we're still learning. And a lot of this, we're learning on the fly. But so far, those are the three things that we found to be pretty predictive of success.
How did you work through the idea maze to get to this specific iteration? Because we'll get into a bunch of these terms like later, but I just know, having studied the space you're in, that these terms, microschooling, homeschooling, we're talking about certification, like these terms like actually mean very specific things. So I'm sure there are a bunch of different iterations of Primer that maybe could have come about. Like maybe you said, hey, like we're gonna totally change the way that teachers are certified so that we could scale the fact that we've identified these teachers. But instead you're building these micro school businesses. So talk us through how you got to the specific version of the company, given the set of problems you identified in the educational status quo.
The very, very first version, sort of in my head, was focus more on how do you make homeschooling mainstream. So how would you build a set of technology products that would make it much easier both for new homeschoolers to sort of cross the chasm and become homeschoolers, and for existing homeschoolers to homeschool more successfully. That was sort of mostly pre-Primer, and then we sort of, the first sort of maybe V1 of Primer was really focused on that. What's interesting is that the original, I look back at the seed memo that we put together for our seed round, the original plan was build this product for homeschoolers and try to get sort of internet scale on that product. And then, based on geographic density, go in and launch microschools for families, because we always sort of knew that like homeschooling had this immovable barrier, which is one parent, or you have to pay someone full time if not a parent, to basically be at home with the kid, 24/7, or at least during school hours. And most parents in the US today, either both parents work or they're a single parent household. Like it's actually very rare for a family to be in a position where one parent, both wants to homeschool and is able to sort of structurally do that because they don't have to work or don't have other obligations. And so we always knew that the end game was micro schools. And so that was always like phase 3. And so we started very, very focused on homeschoolers. And what we realized was that there was more and more people that actually wanted a homeschool-like experience, which was kind of the original thesis, but we thought of that as phase 3. They wanted a homeschool-like experience for their kids, but they didn't want to homeschool them, either because of they were working or didn't feel like it was their life calling or whatever. It became more and more clear to me that micro schools was the end game. And so the idea maze really was originally focused on this sort of software product for homeschoolers. And then I had actually one of the really pivotal moments was having breakfast with someone that I really look up to, who's a longtime sort of founder and entrepreneur. It was sort of early in Primer, and he said, I think that like really the big opportunity here is to go just completely full stack. And I think at some point, like you need to actually deliver the full experience, like the replacement for K through 12, where if you're a parent of a third grader, you can just choose Primer over whatever their existing school is. And for V1 of Primer, really parents were thinking about us as sort of on top of whatever their existing school setup was. And we were sort of this auxiliary product that they would purchase and use. And that was a really pivotal moment for me. And so we can talk more about this transition, but I met someone named Ian Bravo who's actually in On Deck. And he was in Miami and he was building a company in the micro school space, kind of early, figuring it out. And so I had sort of always wanted to figure out ways to accelerate this and to do micro school sooner. And so we decided to kind of team up, and he joined Primer, and that allowed us to get these micro schools off the ground much faster than we kind of originally planned. And now we're off to the races.
Okay, here's what I'm really interested in thinking about, Ryan. So when you're talking about a micro school and you're talking about this top 1% teacher, let's get into the structure of what that actually looks like, especially when this is just an auxiliary product to the homeschool experience. Because, for example, where I grew up in Oregon, after you left 4th grade, you would have like multiple teachers in elementary school and in middle school. So when you say there's this like top 1% teacher, do you imagine that there is like one teacher who's teaching a bunch of different kids at the same time? across subjects, across different core curriculums? Like, how do you think about articulating what that actually looks like?
So the microschools today that we have are, they're all led by one teacher as sort of the main microschool leader. Depending on the number of kids, this is part of what's really cool about it, is not only can teachers make way more money than they do in the traditional system. So on average, our teachers probably make 40 to 50% more than what they'd make in the existing districts that they teach in. But they also can get an aide to help them out in their class. And so at a certain threshold, they unlock an aide that will help them and can also sort of assist with different subjects and stuff. So you have one microschool leader. And for elementary, as you mentioned, it's very standard in the US that, an elementary teacher teaches all subjects. And at some middle schools or a lot of middle schools, sometimes that's also true, where one teacher's teaching, subjects. And so we use that model right now where most of our kids are in elementary, 3rd through 5th, 3rd through 6th grade. And so that's the current model. And then how we augment that is with online, what we call them as subject matter experts. And so we have, for example, a really exceptional ELA and a really exceptional reading teacher, really exceptional math teacher. And so for specific subjects where kids, whether it's that they need remedial help or they need, they're advanced and they need more support and the micro school leader can't support them directly or just isn't set up to support them directly because of the structure of the class or whatever, kids have these resources. And so one of the stories that I'm really excited about that we just got data back on a couple days ago is there was a student that was in sort of a traditional school system. They came to Primer. They were in actually a really good charter school, but they came to Primer. They were in, I think, 3rd grade, and they were in the 1st percentile for reading and math when they joined. So you can approximate that to being 2+ grades behind in both reading and math, which is obviously sort of a catastrophic situation from an educational progress perspective for this kid. And something that if you didn't correct, they're in 3rd grade, if you didn't correct in the next, figure out how to get them closer to on track in the next, year or two, that's probably sort of a permanent, sort of huge handicap they're going to have in their own sort of academic career and their own academic progress from there on out. We decided to sort of see what we could do if we went all in. And so this kid is incredible. And he said, hey, I want to learn to read. I'm sick of not knowing how to read. And so we set him up on an intensive reading sort of remedial support system where for multiple hours a day, he was getting this sort of world-class, both virtual and in-person reading support. And in, call it 15 to 18 weeks, he went from the 1st percentile in reading to the 30th percentile in reading. And he was the 99th percentile for progress over that period against his peers nationwide. One of the students that made the most progress in the entire US over that period. And so we think of it where the micro school leader is sort of the quarterback of the experience, and they're going to be able to do a lot for these kids and they're going to be able to teach them, but there's always going to be things where they need support. And that's part of what makes the Primer model really special. I think is you're able to pull in through technology, these people that kids wouldn't otherwise have access to at their local school, their local school district that can help them accelerate or help them, catch up if they're behind.
That all-in articulation is super interesting. I guess what I wonder is how consistent and scalable is that if you think about it, right? So if you could create a process to take someone who wants to, obviously, right? The buy-in's a key thing there. How replicable is that? Or do you see this as there's a whole set of teachers who have the ability to give that style of learning to somebody, and they're just basically either not aware of or searching for a model that will most reward that? I'd love to hear how you think about that kind of dynamic.
I definitely believe that there are a lot of incredible teachers in the US, and I think there's a lot of teachers that feel underappreciated and held back by the sort of structure of the existing system, which we should get into. And I think that's part of why you're seeing this huge exodus of teachers leaving the school system. And so I don't think there's a talent shortage from that perspective. I think that there's, I think we could launch tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of micro schools with existing really high quality teachers. The problem that we're really trying to solve it and figure out is the consistency across the experience, across the Primer network of schools. And so that's where technology becomes really important, because we want to allow there's this very important part of it where you want to sort of let each teacher, manifest their vision. And if they want to have a school that's, maybe it's has a big arts focus or a STEM focus. We have one micro school leader right now that's leading this sort of robotics intensive for all of her students. And so that's awesome. And we want them to do that. But there also needs to be some level of consistency where a parent knows, okay, if I join a Primer school, it's going to be extremely high quality. And so I think what I'm probably less concerned about, are there enough teachers at a certain bar? I think there are. And what I'm more concerned about is how do you create a very consistent experience across, some base level consistency across, right now we have 5 micro schools live. Next year, we'll probably have between 20 and 30 live. How do you create this sort of base level experience across these schools without sort of, you don't want it to feel like a franchise or something where they're just like executing the playbook. You want them to have a lot of room to sort of make them their own. And so I think that distinction is what we're most focused on right now, and how to use technology to create that standardization, but also to empower these teachers to really like see their vision come to life.
I think this model is just so fascinating. I have so many questions here. So how do you consider brand in a category like this, right? So I think of like charter schools, so there's KIPP, right? Knowledge is Power program. When you say primer and you want to avoid just sort of like being a pure franchisee situation, you're not McDonald's, you're not Subway. When you see a parent looking at the primer brand, like what do you want them to think?
What we learned this year, which was really interesting, is that parents are extremely loyal and have a very high level of trust in teachers. Either teachers that they already know or teachers that they meet. We want the teacher, the micro school leader, to be the face of that school to that community. And so we want the primer brand to mean something, and most parents associate us with the technology component of what makes the school feel like magic, and these sort of cool missions that their kids get and all that kind of stuff. But we really want it to feel like Miss April's micro school. We want parents to think of it as like, yeah, my kid goes to primer, but they go to Miss April's, primer micro school. And what we've learned is that it's for some parents like, primer, what's that? They haven't heard of us. But when they hear that like, oh, my friend, Miss Francois, her daughter goes to Miss April's micro school, that creates an enormous amount of trust immediately that it would take us weeks or months to earn, in a traditional sort of like brand marketing sense. And so we try to push the teachers, make them sort of the superheroes and the superstars of the school in all of our marketing and all the events. Like we just did an event to launch 5 schools in Miami for next year. And we had the teachers speak and talk about it. So I spoke and I was there, but we really wanted the teacher, one of the teachers was emceeing the whole event. We really want them to be kind of the faces of the experience because they know the community best. And there's a long history of schools in the US where, an out of town charter school provider or whoever comes into a new city and says, oh, we're going to launch a school. We know the best way to do it. Here's why we're better than all the others. And, 90% of the time those schools fail. If you look at the 5, 10, 15-year success rate of these schools, it's not good. And I think a key part of that is that you have these people trying to sort of transplant this model without any local, sort of engagement or local talent driving it. And so we view it as like, hey, we're going to be really good at the regulatory side. We're going to build an amazing platform for teachers to launch schools. We're going to build amazing technology that empowers teachers, parents, and students to have a great experience. But we're going to really put the teacher in the driver's seat and have them be the face and the entrepreneur behind these schools.
Obviously, a lot of the impetus for primer, especially given the way you told your story at the start of the podcast, is your own personal experience and trying to like fill these different gaps. But when you zoom out and look at the US educational system, where does primer fit into that system? And what do you see, what problems do you identify that primer and, also other, startups in the education space see as capable of filling?
I think a lot of people that are in the education sort of startup space have this sort of like, oh, we're gonna take over the world and disrupt everything, and we need to blow up the whole existing system. My view on it is maybe a bit more nuanced than that, and I think that the public school system in the U.S. right now, I think it serves like 3 very distinct functions, and we bundled all that into one name, which is like public schools. But everyone thinks about the academic component. Hey, we're sort of, this is the engine that is responsible for the academic development of the children of the U.S. And that's certainly one component of it, and we could debate how effective it is at that. But another component that's sort of the 2 other components I think are maybe equally important societally, but are very under-discussed. One is that for millions of kids, it's actually basically the way that they're able to get food and have food security. And we sort of totally dismiss this, but it's actually I think a very important and very sad and unfortunate sort of component of public schools. You can do the numbers and the research on this, and it will blow your mind. And the third component is that most parents are working and they need a place for their kids to go from 8 to, if they have aftercare, 8 to 5 every day so they can work. And so there's this babysitting component of school that's very important. This gets back to the sort of structural problem of like, can homeschooling ever go truly mainstream when you have that structural sort of tension? And so I think structurally, I think there's sort of those three components that public school provides. And, we can talk about the academic, it's sort of suboptimal in these, in my opinion, a long list of ways in how they approach academics. But there's these two other things that are very important. And unless you're able to provide both of those things, and this is part of why we decided to go full stack and actually run these micro schools that, are a full substitute for a K through 8 education. Unless you're able to go full stack, like you can have the greatest online academic program in the world, but if you don't have a place for the kids to go, and if you, for lower income families, if you can't provide food security for these kids, they're not going to come out of the public school system to attend your schools. And so that's kind of one piece of it. And then the second piece, which I think is maybe equally or more interesting, is I think that the incentive structure of public schools is sort of fundamentally broken. And so if you think about it, from a teacher's perspective, we have sort of shifted. There's been this shift over the last 30 or 40 years where the incentives are all about sort of optimizing the floor, and they have nothing to do with sort of outperformance or accelerating gains of students. And so we've created an entire culture where the things that you get fired for, it's basically asymmetric downside for every single teacher. If you have too many kids that are failing, or you have too many kids that are behind grade level, like everything is oriented around the percentage of kids that are on grade level, or the percentage of kids that are reading at this certain level, or whatever the MAP score or the state standard tests are, or whatever. What is totally missed is these teachers that go above and beyond for their students. And they have students that are maybe 2 grade levels ahead or 3 grade levels ahead, or blowing away all the test scores. And so in my opinion, like, we've sort of created this asymmetric downside situation where teachers know that like the most important thing is sort of, hyper optimizing this floor. And then we've sort of abandoned all the kids that, and we got really lucky actually that most teachers happen to be altruistically motivated and like are willing to, spend their time after school or their personal dollars, helping kids or buying things for kids or whatever. But for most teachers, they're in this situation where they just structurally have to sort of optimize for raising the floor. And there's some value to that in certain situations, but I just think that structurally, like, I would love to see a situation where there was like huge performance bonuses for teachers, where if certain things happen, or if these students were excelling, you would have these like huge cash performance bonuses that would happen. And so I think there's like some interesting experiments that could be run on a district by district level there. But I think it's very, very difficult to imagine the system changing while the current incentives are in place.
I noticed you, both in your own story, the K through 8, time, and also then obviously in the actual company of Primer, the K through 8 focus. Is there something to that? Is there a reason why you've put high school in a different category?
No, we'll eventually do high school. So this year we were K through 6. And so we basically are adding, we'll add at least 1 grade level every year. So this year we're adding 7th and 8th. We have a lot of families with siblings that want their kids to attend Primer, and so we decided to do 7th and 8th this year. And the intention is that we'll add 1 grade level per year. And high school is actually what I'm really excited about, because there's a lot of really cool things that you can do. You can imagine all the internships and apprenticeships and really cool things that you can do in high school. And so that's a thing that we'll tackle in the next couple of years.
Actually, let's follow up on that, because it's really interesting, because we often talk about K through 12 and the U.S. educational system, but actually there are 3 different iterations of school. Obviously, K through 6, throw in preschool too if you want, middle school, sometimes that's 6 through 8 or 7 and 8, and then high school. Looking at the education space and looking at the opportunities you see, are there any just sort of consistent like learnings or just real differences between those 3 structures as you think about them? So like you said already, in high school, you're going to have internship opportunities. Like that's why the interesting talk about, what if someone's interested in the NFL, that becomes more valid there. Then obviously it's great to have a kindergartner excited about the NFL, but that's going to manifest itself differently. How do you think about those 3 different structures?
So the Montessori movement, especially for early childhood education, maybe up to like 1st or 2nd grade, I think is remarkable. And I think in the US, there's a lot of actually really high quality early childhood Montessori programs. And so like Ray Gurn at Higher Ground, I actually think early childhood is probably the thing that, it is easiest to find perhaps like a top 5%, experience for your kid. If how I think about it, at least that's probably the place in the US where there's some ubiquity of that. You get into middle and high school, and I think it's much more challenging, especially if you're interested in sort of a student-driven, high agency approach. There's no shortage of private schools that will charge you, $40,000 a year to get your kid into Stanford or Harvard. But if you want your kid to be in the driver's seat of their education, if you want them to have agency over how they spend their time every day, if you want them to have long blocks of unstructured time where they can write a book or record an album or start a business or learn how to code or whatever, that really just is very difficult to find. And so I think the differentiation and the opportunity increases as the ages get older. And then I think when you get into high school, as we said, there's even more room. Middle school is a little bit tougher, but in high school, there's so much room to do amazing things. Like a 16, 17-year-old, I mean, these are people that, could be shadowing, their heroes. They could be doing, microbiology research in a lab if they were excited about that. There's all sorts of cool things that you can do. And part of what I'm excited about, internally, we talk about Primer as this engine for helping kids reach their potential. And every kid, we believe has amazing potential. And if you can the goal of education really should just be to unlock that in whatever form is best for that kid. And so I think what I'm excited about is when you can take the Primer brand and the social capital and actual capital that we've built up, and you can turn that into very, very high leverage to unlock opportunities for kids. And so you can imagine things like, okay, we have 5 micro schools in Miami. Next year we'll have 12 to 15 micro schools in Miami. Someday we'll have hopefully 50, 100, 200 micro schools across South Florida. And when we have that, what are all the interesting things you can unlock for those kids? And if there's a 16-year-old that wants to start doing microbiology research, maybe they can just start doing that at the University of Miami Microbiology Lab. They don't have to wait to go write, some funding proposal at MIT at age 20. They can start that 4 years older or 4 years earlier. And then what are the compounding effects of that when you help kids pull forward, getting to do real work on the things that they're excited about? And it's not just the techno-optimist Silicon Valley stuff like microbiology research. It's also if a kid wants to become a plumber or start a coffee shop or own a small business or whatever it is, there's all sorts of cool things that you could start them getting experience and reps on that would help them see, is that actually what they want to spend their time on? Is that actually their passion? But then if it is, give them this huge head start early on. And so that's the kind of stuff that I get really excited about, and was what I got some of that in my high school experience, but would have loved even more. And so that's what I want for my kids.
What I'm curious about here is the in-person versus, URL technology dynamic in the school you're describing, because obviously we're coming off of a difficult time the past 2 years with how remote school clearly went very poorly, whole parts of the country. So I think it'd be straightforward to say get in person, be in a city like Miami, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, that brings to mind cost structures and space, all those different things. So how do you think about all those dynamics, both at a student experience to teacher experience level to you as an actual founder who's building in these spaces?
The best possible experience is absolutely an amazing teacher that's an expert in whatever whether it's a passion you want to pursue or an academic subject or whatever. A best teacher in person in the smallest possible environment, meaning the fewest amount of students to the teacher ratio. That's the best. That's by far the best situation that you could get any kid into. But that's a pipe dream for most kids in the US right now. You're just not going to have this amazing world-class teacher that can sit down with 12 kids and go deep about some specific thing you're excited about. I agree that that's the optimal scenario. I'm not one of these people that thinks virtual is inherently better. But I do think that virtual with a world-class teacher, especially if you can build interesting product experiences, which we're building on top of the virtual experience, when needed and accompanying an in-person teacher, is better than a average in-person experience. Certainly an average teacher with 30 kids in a classroom that's just trying to crank through some predefined curriculum. The nuance around it for me is I think that there is this very important component about an in-person teacher that connects with the kids, that learns what makes you tick, that learns what excites you, what makes you nervous, that knows about your home life, that can support you, that can be that person that connects with you on a very personal, emotional level. We all have had those teachers that have changed our lives, or most people are lucky enough to have that. We want that person to be the Primer micro school leader for every single kid. And so that in-person relationship is very, very important. But we also don't kid ourselves to think that person is going to be an expert in every possible subject and every interest that kids are going to have. I think the magic of Primer, and I think what long-term hopefully will define us, is marrying the two concepts of having this amazing in-person experience, but powering it by technology. And then by doing that, opening up the opportunities for kids to be able to get incredible instruction or mentorship, or even teaming up with other kids across micro schools in a way that they could never get in a traditional setting. And so I think it's that combination to me. And I think, through COVID, I think very warranted, virtual schooling got a very bad rap because it's just, especially in that context, it's a really bad experience. And so, I feel like it's really about how and when you bring it in, and what the context is for kids, and having that like in-person experience with a physical in-person micro school leader. That's the anchor. And then there's sort of the virtual stuff is sort of auxiliary to that.
Something I'm super curious about. What was your reaction as a school founder to the like metaverse hype? Let me be generous to the metaverse space. Like when you saw the, big, like, ASAP Rocky, like performance in Fortnite, and you're like, oh wow, like could you take that and apply that to like a school's context? Like how did you think about that? Because I think the reason why I bring this up is, as someone who tends to look at education reform through a public policy lens, like there are just so many fads that seem to come up every few years that like that was just like the ultimate, like there's an argument for like metaverse schools and being the pioneer there. How do you think through stuff like that? I
mean, we spent literally 0 seconds even thinking or talking about anything metaverse related, I think, internally. I remember several people I think had messaged me like, oh, you should like do Primer in VR or something like 2 years ago or something. I mean, we're so in the weeds on like, how do we decrease the time for a new teacher to launch a new school from like 45 days to 7 days? Like that's the kind of stuff that I'm obsessing over. And how can we get, 500 new schools or 1,000 new schools live next year in a year at some point? We just, a lot of that stuff we tend to just not even pay attention to. And I think, when you're spending, I'm in our schools almost every single week in person with students, and when you're there on the ground, like it's you're so grounded in the problems of those teachers and those families and those kids that I think this stuff that gets the Silicon Valley hype, machine going, it just kind of feels like noise, for better or worse.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting because I remember in the first like Meta, like the company ad, they had students like walking through like a virtual Roman forum. And I could just see a word, and this is why I'm a podcast interviewer and you are an actual founder. I see a word, you're like, that's it. That's the dream. That's where we're focusing. But I'm just hearing from you is that like the actual meat and bones of this space, like are those like big regulatory questions. It's really just like that deeply, I don't want to say less exciting, but it's just definitely not like insert X, Y, or Z like gadget or concept. It's very rooted in that. So, as we're nearing the end here, what I really want to ask you here too is, I think the biggest factor, which we haven't really addressed as much, which is just the regulatory side. Because unlike many areas where founders are trying to disrupt or like attacking problems, you are running into federal government, state government, like local government. I know in certain states it's now possible for parents to have their like per pupil funding unlocked. So hypothetically, there's a world where in certain states like you'll have like a whole set of people who'll be interested in this sort of model because that's more opened up outside of the typical like voucher charter debate. How do you think about the regulatory space, and how should founders in general spending time in regulated spaces think about it too?
I think the biggest thing is to make sure that that kind of stuff excites you and you enjoy it. Because if you're in a regulatory, regulated environment, especially something like education, where there's, as you mentioned, like there's local, there's state, there's federal, there's, all sorts of, existing incumbent forces that are going to come out against you and try to, play dirty and squash you at every turn. And if that kind of stuff intimidates you or is annoying to you, or, you don't find it energizing, then I think it's very important to stay out of these spaces. Conversely, like for me, I love it. I love the fight. I love, figuring out, okay, how do we navigate this? How do we make it easier? That's sort of what I feel like I was born to do. And so I love the whole thing. And so I think from our perspective, where we're most focused from a regulatory perspective, there's, a lot of different organizations working on a lot of different things in education. We're very narrowly focused on trying to make it easier for great teachers to launch schools. And so, there's people focused on ESAs and different things, and they're doing work, but we're really focused on sort of the regulatory path from a exceptional teacher deciding, hey, I want to launch a school, to that school being live with students, able to accept tuition funding at the local land use level, zoning approvals, all the way up to the state Department of Education, attendance reporting, all that. And so we have automated a lot of that internally, and we'll continue to automate a lot more of it. And that's a huge part of Primer long-term is this engine that makes that process for teachers, just abstracts away all the complexity. You can think about it kind of like Stripe Atlas, what they've done for incorporating corporations in the US, we're doing for starting schools. And so even today for a teacher, they basically fill out a couple forms that we give them and say, hey, we need all this information. And then we basically handle, almost everything for them. And we have an amazing person on our team named Joe who kind of leads up this work stream. But we're going to be investing a lot in this and making this even easier, because the process right now, like if you're in Florida and you wanted, in a lot of cities in Florida, and you wanted to start a school, even if you were a very, very sort of, entrepreneurial teacher that loved figuring out how to navigate it, you would just have no shot. There's just no way that you would figure out how to navigate all this. I mean, the first time we did it, it cost us literally hundreds of thousands of dollars and took us hundreds, maybe thousands of hours combined of our team's time. Now it's like, very cheap, very fast, very easy, but figuring out the first time was very hard. And so these processes are super opaque. In some ways they're designed to be confusing. And we just sort of believe that's like sort of fundamentally at odds with the idea that you want to unlock these, great new education models and help teachers be able to serve kids in the way that they feel is best. And so we're very narrowly focused on that work stream, and we're kind of letting other people, work on the other stuff. But that's kind of where we're focused.
So for the, real closing question here, you've hinted at it already, but I'd love to get an articulation from you about your on-deck experience, because obviously this series is about big problems. In this case, we're talking about education. Other contexts, we're talking about housing or something like that. So we hope that we know there are plenty of like potential and current founders who I think would benefit from this sort of on-deck experience, especially if they're attacking these sort of categories. So we'd love for you just to, like I said, again, articulate your on-deck experience.
I didn't actually personally go through on-deck, but we've had multiple people on our team that have gone through it. Ian Bravo, who I mentioned, who leads a lot of our micro school efforts, he was in on-deck. And they've been, amazing supporters for us and been super, super helpful throughout for us through the entire journey. And I think one of the things that's most interesting about it is that we haven't really figured out what the new talent signals will be, or what the sort of, we've had the kind of the old guard of talent signals, what university you went to, GPA, you worked at Goldman, whatever. And that stuff's all sort of played out. And there hasn't really been, I think, a ubiquitous sort of symbol for someone who's, extremely ambitious, great communicator, big vision, works really hard, very talented. And I think what's on deck is kind of becoming is really that sort of moniker for the next generation of super talented founders, of founding team members, employees. And so, yeah, I'm a huge fan of On Deck, and I think, what y'all are doing is amazing, and we've benefited from it massively, and I think we'll continue to.
So the actual last question, what are you excited about in the next year? I feel like I've had the chance of speaking with you like pretty much, once a year for the past bit, knock on wood, of course, I'm very superstitious. What's something that you're just like really pumped to like work on?
Spending time with kids over the past year, the actual students in these schools, has been the most fulfilling experience, I think, of my entire career. Hearing the stories from them, from their families. And so I think for me, it really, I'm very excited about our top level growth goals, and I'm very excited about what that means for, growing the number of micro schools by 4x or 5x year over year. And I'm very excited about all that. But what really gets me going is the trickle down effect of how that translates into individual kids and individual families. I'm honestly just so excited next year. We're on track to grow many multiples of where we are today. And next year, having that many more families and that many more kids that we get to hear the stories from and get to go meet. And, I walk into some of the campuses and the kids are super excited and asking me questions about business and, how do you think about this? Or how do you think about that? And it's just it's amazing, because this is I think, for so many of these kids, they've never had an education experience like this. They've been in the traditional system forever. And so, I think what gets me out of bed and gets me so excited every morning is the idea of having many more multiples of those families and those stories next year. And so I don't think I've ever been more motivated to work on any product or any idea than I am Primer right now. And it just feels like we're in a very special moment. So it's exciting.
That's an excellent and super motivational place to leave it on. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us again in the deep end.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Marshall.